This video is now in session, and in this video we're going to talk about how important the Latino population will be for Democrats and for Republicans in future presidential elections. So this is the electoral map that is a hybrid of it's pretty much what 2024 will start off as in terms of our rankings. This is not quite the 2020 election where in terms of the margins, like Wisconsin was tilt blue, but we shade it as tilt red right now for the 2024 elections. So that's just a note there. You can see here that the green area is states where there are high Latino population centers. So if it's dark green, then that means there are at least 35% of at least 20% of the population is Latino, and then the rest of the states where it's shaded light green is where there's at least, I believe, 10% to 20% of the Latino population. And as you can see, this makes up a majority in and of itself, 277 electoral votes for those with high concentrations of Latino Americans. So you can see here that this is a voter group that Democrats really need if they want to win in the future, as the Rust Belt will get more and more Republican. Democrats have already gotten some of these states: Washington, Oregon, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and Illinois, as well as California. And then the rest of these states are not safe for Democrats. Some of them are likely, though. Colorado is likely. New Mexico is also likely. Now, the rest of these states are the very important parts for Democrats as they start to lose control in Michigan and Pennsylvania. These states are important because they hold a lot of electoral votes: 41, 31, 12, 6, 6, 4, 6, total of 106 electoral votes. If you remove these electoral votes for Republicans, which are pretty strong states, for the Republicans, you can see that there are a total of 90 electoral votes at stake just by these states alone. And if Democrats lose Pennsylvania, if they lose Michigan, then they need every single one of these states in order to win, or at least they need Texas, Arizona, as well as Nevada. So this is where it comes to Republicans versus Democrats, because Latinos aren't necessarily for Democrats. Just because there's a minority group with high concentration in America, that does not mean that Latinos necessarily fall in the same category as Black Americans in voting for Democrats in a wide margin. A lot of them don't care that much, or indifferent about social problems, and are more concerned about their economic problems, how Democrats are going to help them, particularly in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. We see that there are a lot of Latinos along the Rio Grande Valley who voted for Trump instead of Biden. Now, partly that was because both candidates were seen as old white men, and as a result, Latino men were more likely to choose whoever seemed more masculine. But at the same time, it was also a matter of economics for them, because a lot of Latinos along the Rio Grande Valley work for CBP. A lot of them work for oil companies, and the Democrats did not properly take this into account when they were trying to flip Texas. They did not campaign on these kinds of issues, and were not necessarily quite moderate on the CBP when it comes to the CBP, and as well as oil. Even though immigration with Joe Biden's policies may not necessarily affect them directly, it's still a concern to them that Joe Biden is seeming like a person who wants to open immigration up for more people. So it's something that a lot of Latinos in Texas voted against Biden for. Now, it will be a test to see whether Democrats can actually regain in those kinds of coalitions, because they will eventually need them in order to win in future elections, since, again, the Rust Belt is less reliable for Democrats. Another state that Republicans are doing great at and Democrats are not doing good at is Florida. I've mentioned this many times, but Republicans have outflanked Democrats in multiple elections now at this point in Florida. And the reason why is because of their grassroots campaign as well as their messaging. Even though Democrats were able to raise more in Florida, they were only able to raise more near the end of the election, where a lot of Republicans and a lot of swing voters had already voted either early or absentee. The other thing is that Democrats were set back by the pandemic because they could not go door to door during the pandemic, while the Republicans could based on their policies. That said, it's not only about that though. Those were the issues unique to the 2020 election, and we saw that since after the 2008 election, Florida has been trending more and more to the right. Other reasons include the Republicans' messaging in Florida. It's been great. They've crafted their message to the point where they've shaped the Democratic Party to seem like a socialist party, to seem like a far left party, and that's very useful in Florida, especially in Miami-Dade County, where if you look at Little Havana and as well as the Cuban American population, who are sometimes swing voters, they voted for Republicans in large numbers in the 2020 election because of the fact that Democrats was seen as a socialist party. And the reason why that resonates against the reason why that kind of messaging by the Republicans resonates with Cuban Americans is because just look at where they came from. They came from Cuba. Many of them came from Cuba. Many of them Venezuelan Americans came from Venezuela. These are countries where socialist parties have destroyed their countries. So as a result, they moved to Florida. They moved to America in order to avoid that situation from happening, and by portraying the Democratic Party as a socialist party, even though it might have been false, it still resonated with the voters, and that's ultimately what it comes down to in politics, whether you can attract voter bases and especially swing voters to go for you. If you just need another example, let's look at New Mexico. New Mexico has a high population of Latinos and Latino Americans, and you can see here that Biden won by around 5% of the vote. 10.8% of the vote. But this is, even though this is a leg up from Clinton in 2016 with 8.2% of the vote, it's not near where Obama was in 2008, where he was able to win that state by a safe margin. And if we looked at polls in New Mexico in the 2020 election, then you'll see that Biden was supposed to get really close to the safe margin, yet he lost. He won by only 10.8%. Now, it's still a win for him, and a win is a win. But it shows that Latinos, first of all, don't necessarily vote for Democrats, but also that Democrats did not properly resonate with Latino voters, because many of them, again, care more about economics. And we see this reflected in the House elections, where New Mexico's 2nd district flipped from Democratic to Republican, where Harrell was able to win by 53.7% in comparison to Small's 46.3% of the vote. Now, this is a Republican district, yet it's a district that Democrats should have still retained nonetheless, and they didn't. Now, this is not to say that Democrats are completely bad when it comes to Latino messaging. If we look at Arizona, if we look at Colorado, New Mexico, these are 3 states where Democrats have been really good, either in this election or in prior elections, at gaining votes at. Arizona, in this election, they were able to flip it, and that in itself is a reflection of how grassroots efforts in Arizona actually worked for Democrats, where a lot of Democrats went on the ground and talked with Latino voters, and as well as went on Latino radio stations in order to gain the Latino vote in Arizona and flip the state for Joe Biden. For Colorado, the same thing applies, especially in Denver, where they were able to shore up new voters, and the suburbs, where there were a lot of Latinos who voted for Democrats. In Nevada, in prior elections, with the Reid machine, it was a coalition of Latino Americans and white suburbanites, as well as urban voters, and thus Democrats have been able to win in Nevada. Now, albeit it has been less and less, there has been less and less growth over the years, but it's still a win for Democrats nonetheless. So these 3 states show how Democrats can be good at messaging to the Latino voters, yet Texas, Florida, as well as potentially New Mexico are examples of how Democrats are not doing good with Latino messaging, and that's important for the Democrats because, again, they need the Sun Belt in order to win in future elections. If we just take a look at if we just take a look at this kind of map where we have all of these Sunbelt states go for Democrats, that gives you 364 electoral votes. But Michigan, Pennsylvania, as well as Minnesota, they're all expected to eventually become Democratic. Maybe not Minnesota, but in the event that it does, then it becomes less and less electoral votes for the Democrats. You can see that the Democrats with the Sunbelt states still have 320 electoral votes, and they can afford to lose one Sunbelt state. They can afford to lose Florida if they need to. They can afford to lose Texas if they need to, if they have the rest of the states. If they have North Carolina, that opens up even more for them. Meanwhile, if Republicans are able to outflank the Democrats continuously to the point where it becomes long-term, then we can see a situation where the Latino American population breathes new light into the Republican Party, where it gives the Republicans new chances at winning in future elections using the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt strategy. We can see here that kind of election amounts to Republicans having 290 electoral votes by getting the Rust Belt states, and as well as Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. So this is what the Latino population can do for either parties, and that's why it's so important for both parties to focus on these voters. Since even though it was good on Joe Biden to focus on the Rust Belt in 2020, it's not a long-term strategy, and the fact that they lost votes by the Latino populations in Texas and as well as in Florida shows that it's not that Democrats need to do more to gain the Latino vote. They cannot simply take it for granted. Meanwhile, for Republicans, this is a situation where it's very open for them to grab, for them to get a new voter coalition to add on to the white working class base, and as well as non-educated white citizens. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.